Picture this. The year is 1904. You are standing in the sweltering summer heat of St. Louis, Missouri, surrounded by the triumphant clamor of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. It is a monument to progress, a gleaming white city built to celebrate a century of American expansion. But you walk away from the grand palaces of industry and art, drawn by a more primal curiosity, toward a sprawling 47-acre exhibit. This is the Philippine Reservation, and inside you find something that chills you to the bone. Before you is the Igorot Village, a meticulously crafted, yet utterly perverse replica of a tribal community. Men, women, and children, brought halfway across the world, are living in open-air huts, their near-naked bodies on display for your gawking amusement. They perform rituals, pound rice, and stare back at the sea of faces with a disquieting mixture of resignation and contempt. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and the murmur of the crowd, a crowd that points, laughs, and buys photographs, treating these human beings as living specimens in a sprawling, open-air cage. You have just entered the chilling world of the human zoo. And now, please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. The St. Louis World's Fair of 1904 was not merely an event. It was a grand, theatrical statement of American identity at the dawn of a new century. Fresh from its victory in the Spanish-American War, the United States had acquired new overseas territories, including the Philippines, and the fair was a platform to both celebrate and justify this nascent empire. The Philippine Reservation was its crown jewel of propaganda, the largest and most expensive exhibit designed by the government to showcase the supposed benevolence of American colonialism. It was a journey through a carefully constructed racial hierarchy. Visitors could walk from the villages of the civilized and Christianized Visayans, presented as ready for American tutelage, to the more primitive groups, culminating in the most sensationalized display of all, the Igorot. Billed as headhunting, dog-eating savages, the Igorot people became the fair's must-see attraction, a living embodiment of the white man's burden. The organizers, men of science and government like Albert Jenks and William P. Wilson, were the architects of this dehumanizing theater. They were the dysfunctional tyrants of this microcosm, their obsession with racial classification and imperial justification manifesting as a systematic cruelty disguised as education. The Igorot families, like the helpless victims in this grand narrative, were trapped. Recruited with vague promises of wealth and adventure, they found themselves transported to a humid Missouri summer, forced to live in a state of performance. The most lurid myth, that of their diet of dog, was actively encouraged. Fair organizers would provide them with dogs, ensuring a steady supply for the morbidly curious crowds who gathered to witness the spectacle, a spectacle that reinforced their own sense of superiority. Can you imagine the psychological torture? To have your culture reduced to a single, grotesque caricature, to perform your sacred rituals for the jeering entertainment of your colonizers, to see your children's faces reflected in the cold, curious eyes of 1,000 strangers each day. This was not anthropology. It was a political psychosis played out on a human stage, where the lines between education, entertainment, and exploitation were not just blurred, but erased entirely by the intoxicating ideology of empire. The very ground of the fair, dedicated to progress, was soaked in a profound and deliberate act of dehumanization. Long before the grand, industrial-scale human showcases of the late 19th century, the seed of this perversion had been planted in the courts of Europe during the Age of Discovery. The practice began not as a public spectacle, but as a private curiosity for the wealthy and powerful. When Christopher Columbus returned from his first voyage in 1493, he did not just bring back gold and parrots, he brought back 6 captive Taino people, presenting them to the Spanish court of Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II as living trophies of his discovery. They were the first in a long, tragic parade of human beings torn from their homes and displayed as exotic curiosities, their humanity secondary to their novelty. Yet, no story from this early period encapsulates the horror and the systemic nature of this exploitation more profoundly than that of Saartjie Baartman. Born around 1789 in the Eastern Cape of what is now South Africa, she was a member of the Khoikhoi people. After her partner was killed by a Dutch colonist, Saartjie found herself in the service of a man named Hendrik Caesars. It was here that her life took its tragic turn. Caesars and his associate, an English ship's surgeon named Alexander Dunlop, were struck by her Steatopygia genetic characteristic of some Khoisan women that results in large accumulations of fat on the buttocks. They saw not a woman, but a profitable spectacle. They became the enforcers of a system that valued her body parts over her personhood. Convincing her with false promises of wealth and fame, they took her to London in 1810. There, she was put on display in Piccadilly, billed as the Hottentot Venus. For a shilling, the public could gawk at her semi-naked form as she was forced to walk, stand, and sit on command. For an extra fee, they could poke her. She was a helpless victim trapped in a nightmare, her body a source of public amusement and scientific intrigue, her spirit slowly being crushed under the weight of a million leering eyes. The air in the showroom would have been thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and wet wool, the noise a constant hum of whispers and cruel laughter. Her protestations and moments of defiance were framed as part of the act, evidence of her savage nature. The Abolitionist Society, the African Association, took up her case, bringing Caesars to court for her exploitation. But the system was rigged against her. Saartjie, likely coerced, testified that she was a willing participant, that she received a portion of the profits. The case was dismissed, and her chains, both literal and metaphorical, were tightened. The ordeal of Saartjie Baartman did not end in the grimy showrooms of London. It metastasized into a new, more sinister form of exploitation under the guise of scientific inquiry. After the court case, her notoriety waned, and her handler, Hendrik Césars, sold her to a French animal trainer named Rowe. She was taken to Paris, the supposed heart of European civilization and enlightenment, where her degradation reached its nadir. In France, she was exhibited in even more brutal conditions, often alongside a rhinoceros, her humanity explicitly equated with that of an exotic beast. But it was the scientific community, the complicit enforcers of racial ideology, who would inflict the most lasting wounds. She caught the attention of Georges Cuvier, a renowned naturalist and anatomist, considered one of the fathers of paleontology. Cuvier was a key proponent of polygenism, the theory that human races were of different origins, which he used to construct a scientific hierarchy with white Europeans at the apex and black Africans at the very bottom. To Cuvier, Saartjie was not a person. She was a living link to the animal kingdom, a specimen to be studied. He subjected her to a series of humiliating examinations, persuading her to pose nude for painters and scientists in the Jardin du Roi. Imagine the cold, sterile room filled with the most powerful scientific men in France, their eyes crawling over her body with the dispassionate calculation of butchers. They measured her skull, her limbs, her genitals, all in a perverse quest to prove her inferiority. Can you fathom the psychological violation of being reduced to a set of data points, your very being used as evidence for a theory that denied your humanity? Saartjie died in 1815, at the age of just 26, from an undetermined inflammatory ailment, likely exacerbated by poverty, illness, and a profound despair. But for Cuvier, her death was an opportunity. He obtained her body, dissected it, and made a full plaster cast. He then pickled her brain and genitals, placing them in jars for display at the Musée de l'Homme, the Museum of Man. For over 150 years, her remains, alongside her skeleton, were on public display, a permanent testament to the grotesque marriage of racism and science. Her body, which had been a spectacle in life, remained a spectacle in death, a final, post-mortem violation. It was only in 2002, after years of pleading from the South African government initiated by President Nelson Mandela, that her remains were finally repatriated and buried in her homeland, a somber end to a story that serves as a haunting allegory for the entire colonial project. The isolated, ad hoc cruelty inflicted upon individuals like Saartjie Baartman was destined to evolve. As the 19th century progressed, the twin engines of industrial capitalism and high imperialism created a fertile ground for the practice of human exhibition to grow into a global, highly organized, and immensely profitable industry. What was once a morbid curiosity for aristocrats became mass entertainment, a crucial piece of the ideological machinery that justified colonial expansion to the citizens back home. The driving force behind this transformation was a new brand of pseudoscience that sought to classify and rank every human population on Earth. Theories like phrenology, which claimed to deduce character from the shape of the skull, and social Darwinism, a grotesque misapplication of Darwin's theories of evolution to human societies, provided the intellectual backbone for this project. These weren't fringe ideas, they were mainstream science, taught in universities and debated in the halls of power. They created a narrative in which the conquest and subjugation of other peoples was not an act of aggression, but a natural, even noble, process, the civilizing mission. The human zoo became the living textbook for this ideology. Why read a dry anthropological tract when you could see savagery in the flesh? For the price of a ticket, the average citizen of London, Paris, or Berlin could gaze upon a living diorama of a primitive African village or a cannibal island from the South Pacific. They could see for themselves the supposed evidence of the racial hierarchy, confirming their own position at its pinnacle. This spectacle served a dual purpose. It was both thrillingly exotic and deeply reassuring. It presented the colonial other as non-threatening, childlike, and backward, reinforcing the idea that empire was a benevolent act of paternalism. The men, women, and children in these exhibits, stripped of their context, history, and individuality, became generic representatives of their race, their complex cultures reduced to a few sensationalist bullet points. The dysfunctional tyrant in this phase was not a single person, but the entire intellectual and political establishment of the West, a system whose deep-seated racial anxieties and imperial ambitions manifested as a vast, international theater of cruelty. The complicit enforcers were the millions who bought tickets, whose casual curiosity and unthinking prejudice fueled the demand for more and more of these human displays, turning prejudice into a profitable, self-perpetuating cycle of dehumanization. No single individual did more to systematize and commercialize the display of human beings than a German animal trader from Hamburg named Karl Hagenbeck. Before Hagenbeck, human exhibitions were often haphazard affairs. He, however, approached the practice with the same entrepreneurial genius and logistical rigor he applied to his international animal trade, effectively inventing the modern, ethnological exhibition. Hagenbeck was a complex figure, a quintessential tyrant of his domain who saw himself not as a cruel exploiter, but as an educator and a pioneer. His personal obsession with authenticity drove the narrative of his business. He wasn't just displaying people, he was, in his own mind, recreating their entire world for the benefit of the European public. He began in 1874, when he exhibited a group of Sami people from Lapland, complete with their tents, weapons, and a herd of reindeer. The show was a massive success, and Hagenbeck realized he had stumbled upon a goldmine. He quickly expanded his enterprise, creating what he called Völkerschauen, or people shows. His method was formulaic and effective. He would send agents across the globeto, Sri Lanka, Patagonia, Somalia, Greenland to recruit individuals for his troops. The contracts they signed were often deceptive, written in languages they couldn't understand, promising good pay and a safe return that didn't always materialize. Once in Europe, these troops were installed in purpose-built villages within Hagenbeck's Tierpark, his zoo in Hamburg, or sent on tour to major cities like Paris, London, and Berlin. The key to Hagenbeck's innovation was the mixing of people and animals from the same region, creating a naturalistic panorama that blurred the line between humanity and beast in the minds of his audience. He would display a Nubian troop alongside African elephants and ostriches, or a group of Sinhalese with their sacred cattle. This was a deliberate choice, designed to reinforce the idea that these people were closer to nature, less evolved, and fundamentally different from the civilized Europeans peering at them through the fences. The logistics were staggering. He managed the transport of hundreds of people across oceans, designed and constructed their authentic villages, managed their diets, and choreographed their daily performances of ritual and craft. The victims of this system were subjected to a grueling routine, a life lived under constant surveillance, their every action a form of entertainment for a paying public. The cold European climate often led to illness, with respiratory diseases like pneumonia and tuberculosis being tragically common. Death was a constant risk, an accepted collateral damage in the pursuit of profit and spectacle. Hagenbeck, the visionary showman, had perfected the machinery of the human zoo, transforming a sporadic practice into a polished, repeatable, and immensely popular form of mass entertainment that would define an era. To truly comprehend the psychological horror of a Hagenbeck exhibition, one must try to imagine the experience from the perspective of those on display. Consider, for example, one of his popular Somali troops, recruited from the Horn of Africa and brought to the alien world of Imperial Germany in the late 19th century. These were proud people warriors, herders, and artisans from a hot, arid land, suddenly thrust into the damp, bone-chilling cold of a Hamburg winter. The journey itself would have been a disorienting nightmare, a long sea voyage in cramped quarters, filled with incomprehensible languages and unfamiliar food. Upon arrival, they were not greeted as guests or employees, but installed like livestock into their new home, a fabricated village of huts, constructed from plaster and wood, surrounded by a fence. Their world shrank to the size of this enclosure. Their daily lives were a rigid performance schedule. They were expected to brandish their spears, perform war dances, weave baskets, and engage in mock battles, all for the amusement of a crowd that stared with a mixture of fear and fascination. Can you imagine the gnawing humiliation of it? To have the sacred dances of your ancestors reduced to a theatrical sideshow, your traditional clothing turned into a costume. Their every moment was public. They ate in public, they socialized in public, they mourned their sick and dying in public. There was no privacy, no escape from the relentless gaze of the crowd. The sounds would have been a constant torment, the murmur of German voices, the laughter, the occasional shouted insult. The faces in the crowd would have blurred into a single, monstrous entity, a sea of white skin and strange clothes, their eyes holding the cold calculation of a farmer inspecting his herd. These were the helpless victims, their agency stripped away, their identities flattened. They were no longer individuals with names, families, and histories. They were simply the Somalis. The complicit system enforcers were not just Hagenbeck and his agents, but every single person who bought a ticket. Each coin dropped at the gate was a vote for the continuation of this misery, a small act that collectively powered a vast engine of dehumanization. The emotional toll must have been immeasurably, a hollow dread settling in the stomach like a stone, a gnawing homesickness, a profound sense of dislocation and despair. Some resisted in small ways, refusing to perform or showing open contempt for the audience, but such acts of defiance were often punished or misinterpreted as part of the savage spectacle. For most, the only path to survival was a kind of psychological retreat, a deadening of the soul to endure the unendurable. The human zoo reached its zenith, not in the private parks of impresarios like Hagenbeck, but on the grandest stages imaginable, the great world's fairs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These colossal expositions were the ultimate expressions of Western industrial, colonial, and scientific supremacy. Cities like Paris, Chicago, and St. Louis competed to host the most spectacular event, building vast temporary cities to showcase their nation's achievements. And at the heart of these celebrations of progress, the human zoo became an indispensable and central feature. These were not fringe sideshows. They were official, government-sanctioned exhibits, presented as educational and patriotic. The Paris Exposition Universelle of 1889 is a stark example. While the world marveled at the brand-new Eiffel Tower, a symbol of modern engineering, visitors could also wander through a village nègre, a Negro village populated by 400 people taken from across the French colonial empire. The juxtaposition was the entire point. The towering steel of French genius on one hand, and the primitive life of its colonial subjects on the other. The message was clear and powerful. This is what we have achieved, and this is who we are, civilizing. The human displays at these fairs were staggering in their scale and ambition. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, built to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, was organized along a starkly racialized geography. The formal, neoclassical, white city housed the exhibits of art, science, and industry from the civilized nations of Europe and America. In stark contrast, the raucous and chaotic Midway Plaisance was the designated zone for entertainment and the ethnological exhibits. Here, visitors could find a street in Cairo, a German village, and most tellingly, villages of Dahomayan people from West Africa and Native Americans, including the famous Lakota chief Sitting Bull, who had earlier toured with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Their cultures were presented as commodities, their humanity an afterthought. These fairs were the ultimate manifestation of the dysfunctional tyrant as a national ideology. The state itself became the showman, using its immense resources to stage the most elaborate and convincing racial hierarchies. The victims were numbered in the thousands, brought from every corner of the globe to live in these temporary Potemkin villages, their lives becoming a performance of imperial ideology. The public, numbering in the tens of millions, consumed this spectacle eagerly. Their national pride and sense of civilizational superiority affirmed with every savage dance and primitive ritual they witnessed. Within this vast and horrifying history of human exhibition, one story stands out for its sheer, concentrated cruelty and its heartbreaking conclusion. It is the story of a young man named Ota Benga, and it serves as the ultimate indictment of the entire system, a tragedy that lays bare the so-called science and education for the barbaric fraud it truly was. Ota Benga was a Muti man from the Ituri forest, in what was then the Congo Free State, a territory under the personal and notoriously brutal rule of King Leopold II of Belgium. His early life was shattered by the genocidal violence of Leopold's private army, the Force Publique, who terrorized the region to enforce rubber quotas. His wife and 2 children were murdered in a raid. He himself was captured by slave traders. His life, already destroyed by one form of colonial violence, was about to intersect with another. In 1904, an American explorer and self-styled anthropologist named Samuel Phillips Werner was in Africa, tasked with acquiring pygmies for the St. Louis World's Fair. Werner was a man driven by ambition and a firm belief in the racial theories of his day, a classic complicit system enforcer who saw the people of the Congo not as human beings but as potential exhibits. He found Ota Benga at a slave market and purchased him for a pound of salt and a bolt of cloth. Werner would later claim this was an act of rescue, but his subsequent actions reveal the truth. Ota Benga had simply been transferred from one form of ownership to another. He was brought to St. Louis along with other Mbuti people to be displayed in the anthropological exhibit. He was a sensation. His small stature and his teeth, which had been ritually filed to sharp points, fascinated the crowds. They saw him as a real-life cannibal, a creature from the deepest, darkest jungle. He was gawked at, prodded, and followed everywhere by curious mobs. He was, in essence, a prisoner in a vast, open-air cell. Ota Benga, however, was not a passive victim. He resisted. He learned to charge the crowd for a glimpse of his teeth. He sometimes shot at them with his bow and arrow. His frustration and anger, born of profound grief and dislocation, were palpable. But his resistance was futile, framed by the press and the organizers as yet more evidence of his untamed nature. When the fair ended, his ordeal should have been over. Werner was supposed to return him to the Congo, but the journey was fraught, and Ota Benga, finding his own village gone and feeling alienated from other groups, chose to return to the United States with Werner. He had no home left to go to. The civilized world that had destroyed his past was now his only option for a future that would hold a horror even greater than the St. Louis Fair. The second act of Ota Benga's tragedy is almost impossible to comprehend, a moment when the subtext of the human-zooth equation of non-white people with animals became horrifyingly explicit. After his return to the United States, Samuel Werner, finding himself in financial difficulty, sought a place to deposit his charge. In 1906, he approached William Temple Hornaday, the director of the newly opened Bronx Zoo and a prominent zoologist. Hornaday was also a leading eugenicist and a co-founder of the American Bison Society. He, along with his friend Madison Grant, another powerful eugenicist who would later write the influential racist tract, The Passing of the Great Race, saw a unique opportunity. They agreed to house Ota Benga at the zoo. At first, he was given the run of the grounds, helping the keepers. But soon, Hornaday and Grant enacted their monstrous plan. They moved Ota Benga into the monkey house exhibit. They put a hammock in the enclosure, scattered some bones on the floor to suggest cannibalism, and gave him a bow and arrow to shoot at a target. For a time, his primary companion in the cage was an orangutan named Dohong. A sign was posted on the cage, a testament to the absolute moral bankruptcy of these men of science. It read, "The Pygmy, Ota Benga, age 23 years, height 4 feet 11 inches, weight 103 pounds. Brought from the Kasai River, Congo Free State, South Central Africa, by Dr. Samuel P. Werner. Exhibited each afternoon during September. He was no longer a man. He was an exhibit, listed alongside the vital statistics of the other animals. The dysfunctional tyrants in this scenario were Hornaday and Grant, their perverted scientific racism metastasizing into an act of public cruelty that shocked even the sensibilities of early 20th century New York. Crowds flocked to the zoo, numbering in the tens of thousands. The New York Times and other papers reported on the spectacle with a tone of morbid fascination. Can you imagine the sheer, soul-crushing despair to have survived the slaughter of your family, the terror of the slave market, the humiliation of the World's Fair, only to find yourself caged with an ape, your humanity officially and publicly stripped away by the most respected scientific institution in the country? This was the logical endpoint of the entire human zoo phenomenon, the moment the mask of education and anthropology was ripped away to reveal the grotesque, racist skull beneath. Ota Benga, the helpless victim, was now, definitively, an animal in a cage. The exhibition of Ota Benga in the monkey house of the Bronx Zoo was so brazen, so profoundly shocking, that it provoked a fierce and immediate backlash, primarily from the city's African-American community. A group of black clergymen, led by the Reverend Dr. James H. Gordon of the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum in Brooklyn, mounted a passionate campaign to secure Ota Benga's freedom. Gordon was incensed, recognizing the display for what it was, a grotesque insult to his entire race and a brutal act of cruelty against a fellow human being. He confronted the zoo director, William Hornaday, directly. "Our race, we think, is depressed enough, without exhibiting one of us with the apes," Gordon declared. We think we are worthy of being considered human beings, with souls. Hornaday, the arrogant enforcer of the eugenicist system, was dismissive and contemptuous. He defended his actions in the press, arguing with breathtaking cynicism that he was simply offering an interesting ethnological exhibit. When that failed to quell the outrage, he claimed he was merely providing a home for a man who had nowhere else to go, a preposterous justification for putting him in a cage with an orangutan. Madison Grant, the arch-racist ideologue, went even further, lamenting that the opposition was depriving the city of a valuable scientific lesson and suggesting that it was rank sentimentalism to object. The debate raged in the city's newspapers. The zookeepers and their powerful supporters argued that Ota Benga was happy, that he enjoyed the attention. They framed the protesters as overly sensitive and ignorant of the scientific importance of the exhibit. This public battle was a microcosm of the larger war of ideas being waged in society. On one side stood the forces of scientific, racism, institutional power, and a deeply ingrained colonial mindset. On the other stood a coalition of humanitarians and black leaders fighting for the simple, radical idea that a black man from Africa was, in fact, a man. The pressure mounted. Mayor George B. McClellan Jr. refused to intervene directly but privately condemned the exhibit. The public, while initially flocking to see the spectacle, began to grow uneasy. After weeks of relentless protest and negative publicity, Hornaday, defiant to the end, finally relented. Ota Benga was released from his cage, but the victory was a hollow one. The scars of his ordeal were carved deep into his soul. He was a free man, but he was a man utterly destroyed, a ghost haunting the civilized world that had first orphaned him and then caged him like a beast. After his release from the Bronx Zoo, the custody of Ota Benga was transferred to Reverend Gordon's Howard-colored orphan asylum. The men and women there tried to give him a home, to repair the profound damage that had been done. But how do you mend a shattered soul? How do you teach a man to live in a world that has just finished publicly debating whether he is, in fact, a man at all? His journey of civilization began. He was dressed in American clothes, which he reportedly tore off at the first opportunity. He was enrolled in a school, but his spirit, forged in the freedom of the Ituri forest, rebelled against the confines of a classroom. He was a man of profound intelligence, but his intelligence was not suited to this alien environment. Eventually, he was moved to Lynchburg, Virginia, and placed under the care of the poet Anne Spencer and her husband, who arranged for him to live at the Virginia Theological Seminary and College. Here, for a time, there was a glimmer of hope. He was tutored by the college's president, Gregory W. Hayes. He began to learn English. Most symbolically, he paid a dentist to have his pointed teeth capped, a desperate attempt to erase the physical marker of the otherness that had been the source of his fame and his misery. He took on jobs, working in a local tobacco factory, and spent his free time in the forests surrounding Lynchburg, teaching the local boys his hunting and fishing skills. In these moments, surrounded by nature, he seemed to find a fleeting peace, a shadow of the life that had been stolen from him, but it was only a shadow. The core of his being was hollowed out by an inconsolable loneliness and a desperate, all-consuming longing for home. He spoke often of returning to the Congo. The world of Lynchburg, however kind some of its inhabitants were, was not his world. The laughter of the children he taught to hunt was not the laughter of his own murdered children. The forests of Virginia were not the Ituri forest. He was adrift in a sea of kindness that could never truly reach him, a permanent exile. Can you imagine the suffocating weight of his memories, the ghosts of his family, the echoes of the jeering crowds, the metallic clang of the cage door? He was a man out of time and out of place, a living embodiment of the human cost of empire and scientific arrogance. The final chapter of Ota Benga's story is one of utter desolation. As the years passed in Lynchburg, his dream of returning to the Congo became his single, organizing purpose, the one flickering light in the darkness of his exile. He began to save money, planning his passage back to Africa, back to the only place he had ever called home. But the world, which had already dealt him so many cruel blows, had one more in store. In 1914, the outbreak of World War I brought all transatlantic passenger travel to a halt. His path home was cut off. The last glimmer of hope was extinguished. With the route to his past blocked, Ota Benga spiraled into a deep and profound depression. His already fragile grip on his new life slipped completely. He became more withdrawn, more volatile. The man who had survived the forced public, the slave market, the World's Fair, and the Bronx Zoo was finally broken, not by overt cruelty, but by the slow, grinding hopelessness of his situation. In March of 1916, the pain became too much to bear. He went into the woods and built a large, ceremonial fire, a ritual from a life he could never reclaim. He then removed the caps from his teeth, in a final, defiant act of reclaiming his identity from the world that had tried to reshape it. Then, using a pistol he had stolen, Otabenga, the man who had been displayed as a savage, a cannibal, and an ape-man, shot himself through the heart. He was 32 years old. His suicide was not the act of a madman. It was the final, logical, and most tragic act of resistance available to him. It was a statement. He was choosing the terms of his own exit from a world that had offered him nothing but exploitation and sorrow. The story of Otabenga is a perfect, horrifying parable. It contains all the archetypes: the helpless victim, Otabenga himself, the dysfunctional tyrant, in the form of the colonial system and men like Leopold, and the complicit system enforcers, men like Werner, Hornaday, and Grant, who used the language of science and progress to justify their barbarism. His life and death serve as a permanent, undeniable stain on the conscience of the institutions that exploited him, and a haunting reminder of the real, human consequences of reducing people to objects of curiosity. While stories of utter victimhood, like those of Saartjie Baartman and Otabenga, are essential to understanding the depths of this cruel practice, it is equally important to recognize that the people on display were not always passive objects of exploitation. They were human beings with agency, and in many cases, they fought back, resisted, and sought to control their own destinies in a system designed to crush their spirits. This narrative of resistance adds a crucial layer of complexity, reminding us that even in the face of overwhelming power, the human drive for dignity persists. One of the most remarkable examples of this resistance comes from a group of 8 Kwakwaka'waka'wak people from British Columbia, who were recruited by an agent of Carl Hagenbeck in 1885. They were taken to Germany and put on display, but they soon realized the conditions were not what they had been promised. They were treated poorly, and their cultural performances were misrepresented. Rather than simply enduring their fate, they did something extraordinary. They found a lawyer and sued their promoter in a German court for breach of contract and for the return of their cultural artifacts. Even more astonishingly, they won. The court sided with the Kwakwaka'wakwa, and they were able to secure passage home. This was a rare but powerful victory, a demonstration that the legal and moral systems of the exploiters could sometimes be turned against them. Other acts of resistance were more desperate. In 1892, a group of Galabi people from French Guiana, who were being exhibited in a cage at the Jardin d'Acclimatation in Paris, managed to escape their enclosure. They fled into the city, creating a panic and a media sensation. They eventually sought refuge with a French anti-slavery politician, using their escape to publicly protest their treatment. Even on a smaller, daily scale, resistance took many forms. Individuals would refuse to perform, deliberately misunderstand instructions, or openly mock the audience. They worked to maintain their cultural and religious practices in secret, away from the prying eyes of the crowd, creating small pockets of dignity and humanity within the dehumanizing confines of the exhibit. They formed bonds of solidarity with other displayed troops, sharing information and support. These stories are vital because they disrupt the simple, two-dimensional portrait of the helpless victim. They show that these were resourceful, resilient, and courageous individuals who navigated an impossible situation with intelligence and defiance. They were not merely things that were acted upon, they were actors in their own right, fighting for their humanity against a world that was determined to deny it. The decline of the human zoo was not a sudden event, but a slow, gradual fading away, driven by a confluence of technological, social, and political shifts. The same forces of modernity that had given rise to the spectacle ultimately contributed to its demise. One of the most significant factors was the advent of a new technology, cinema. Motion pictures offered a new, and in many ways more potent, way to consume the exotic. Audiences could now watch flickering images of faraway lands and primitive peoples in the comfort of a dark theater, without the inconvenient reality of living, breathing, and sometimes uncooperative human beings. Films could be edited, scored, and narrated to create an even more powerful and controlled colonial fantasy than a live exhibition. The ethnographic film, pioneered by figures like Robert Flaherty with Nanook of the North, carried on the tradition of the human zoo in a new medium, presenting a highly romanticized and often staged version of indigenous life. Simultaneously, public sensibilities in the West began to change, albeit slowly. The unbridled jingoism of the late 19th century gave way to a growing unease with the more overt forms of racial exploitation. The horrors of World War I, a conflict that saw civilized European nations slaughter each other by the millions, made grand pronouncements of racial and cultural superiority ring hollow. The war shattered the myth of inevitable progress and exposed the dark underbelly of nationalism. In the post-war era, anti-colonial movements began to gain strength and find a voice on the international stage. Protests against human exhibitions became more organized and effective. Activists, both from within the colonized nations and from sympathetic groups in the West, condemned the practice as a barbaric relic. The scientific consensus also began to shift. The crude racial typologies of the 19th century, with their focus on skull measurements and simplistic hierarchies, were gradually discredited and replaced by more sophisticated anthropological and genetic models that emphasized the unity, rather than the division, of the human species. While racism was far from defeated, its scientific foundations were crumbling. The last major human zoo is often considered to be the Brussels World's Fair of 1958, where a Congolese village was still on display, sparking widespread protest. By then, the practice had become an embarrassing anachronism, a holdover from a colonial era that was rapidly drawing to a close. The cages were dismantled, but the legacy of what they represented would linger for generations. Though the physical enclosures of the human zoos have been torn down, their intellectual and cultural architecture remains deeply embedded in the foundations of the modern world. The logic of the spectacle, the act of othering for profit and political gain, has not vanished. It has simply shape-shifted. One can see its direct descendant in the most exploitative forms of cultural tourism, where indigenous communities are often pressured to perform a simplified, romanticized version of their culture for the cameras of foreign visitors. The Living Village tour can be a modern, more subtle version of the ethnological exhibition, where people's daily lives are once again turned into a commodity, their authenticity a carefully managed performance. The stereotypes that these zoos help to create and popularize have proven incredibly resilient. The image of the noble savage, the brutal warrior, or the childlike native continues to haunt popular culture, from Hollywood films to advertising. These caricatures, born in the fairgrounds of the 19th century, continue to inform perceptions and policies, perpetuating a colonial gaze that views non-Western cultures through a lens of condescension or romantic fantasy. Perhaps the most tangible and contentious legacy of the human zoo era is the vast collection of human remains and cultural artifacts that still reside in the museums of Europe and North America. The same scientific institutions that once championed the display of living people also amassed enormous collections of their skeletons, skulls, and sacred objects, often acquired through theft, coercion, or unethical excavations. The struggle for the repatriation of these remains, like those of Saartjie Baartman, is a direct confrontation with the legacy of the human zoo. It is a fight to reclaim not just bones, but history, dignity, and spiritual integrity. For the descendants of those who were displayed, the fight for repatriation is a fight to undo an act of profound historical violence, to bring their ancestors home and finally grant them the peace they were denied in life and in death. The story of the Igorot people, for example, did not end in St. Louis. The legacy of their exhibition as dog-eaters has had a lasting and painful impact on their identity and how they are perceived within the Philippines itself, a stark reminder that the wounds inflicted by these spectacles can fester for generations. The human zoo is not a closed chapter of history, its echoes are all around us, a quiet but persistent reminder of the enduring power of prejudice and the long, difficult road toward true post-colonial reckoning. To truly understand the phenomenon of the human zoo, one must look beyond the impresarios and the scientists and turn a critical gaze toward the crowd. What drew millions of ordinary people, shopkeepers, factory workers, teachers, and their children to these spectacles of organized degradation? The answer is a complex and unsettling cocktail of human psychology. It was, of course, about curiosity and a thirst for the exotic in an increasingly interconnected but still mysterious world. But it was a curiosity laced with a profound sense of superiority. To gaze upon the savage was to affirm one's own civilization. The act of looking down on the people in the enclosure was an act of self-definition. By defining what was primitive, backward, and strange, the spectator could more clearly define what was modern, advanced, and normal, namely, themselves. This was the psychology of the colonial project distilled into a single, transactional experience. There was also an element of fear, a titillating fear that was safely contained by the presence of a fence or a cage. The wild men with their spears and the cannibals with their filed teeth were thrilling because they represented a primal danger that had been tamed and put on display for safe consumption. It was a way for an increasingly urbanized and industrial society to reconnect with a fantasy of the wild, while simultaneously celebrating its conquest over it. Can we not see a dark mirror in this? The act of othering is a fundamental human impulse, a way that groups have always defined themselves in opposition to their neighbors. But the human zoos industrialized this impulse on an unprecedented scale. They took a latent prejudice and turned it into a mass-produced commodity. They provided a seemingly scientific and educational justification for what was, at its core, a primal need to feel superior and secure in one's own identity. To stand in that crowd in 1893 Chicago or 1904, St. Louis was to participate in a collective ritual of self-affirmation, paid for by the stolen dignity of others. It is easy for us, a century later, to condemn these crowds, but it is more challenging, and perhaps more important, to ask what modern spectacles serve a similar psychological function for us today. Where do we go to have our own identities and our own sense of cultural superiority painlessly reaffirmed? The human zoo holds up a mirror not just to the past, but to the persistent and often dark corners of human nature itself. In the end, what remains is a profound and somber silence, the silence of stories that can never be fully told, of lives that were irrevocably broken. The history of the human zoo is a vast and sprawling necropolis, filled with the ghosts of thousands of unnamed individuals. We may know the name of Ota Benga or Saartjie Baartman, but for every story that has been recorded, there are countless others that have been lost to the winds of history. Who were the Sami people who shivered through a German winter for Karl Hagenbeck's profit? What were the names of the children in the Igorot Village who learned to perform their childhood for a gawking crowd? What songs did the Dahomian warriors sing at night in their Chicago enclosure to remind themselves of home? These are questions that history, with its focus on the powerful and the written record, can rarely answer. The human cost is incalculable, measured not just in the deaths from disease and despair, but in the generational trauma, the cultural disruption, and the deep, spiritual wounds that were inflicted. The practice was a systematic campaign of soul murder, disguised as entertainment and education. It was the public expression of a political psychosis that saw entire peoples as less than human, as raw material for the great project of empire. To reflect on the human zoo is to confront the terrifying capacity of ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty, to see how easily the veneer of civilization can be stripped away by the intoxicating allure of power and prejudice. It forces us to ask the most unsettling of questions: what is the true measure of progress? And what darkness are we willing to tolerate in its name? The legacy of these exhibitions is a solemn duty to remember, not just the spectacle, but the human beings at its heart, to say their names when we can, and to honor their silent, stolen histories when we cannot.